Hello, everybody, and welcome into this episode of the Sports Detective Show on YouTube. If this is your first time ever discovering the show, feel free to please hit that subscribe button, hit that like button if you like this kind of content. I've been doing podcasts for over 3 years now, and I'm just starting to post YouTubes and podcast episodes on YouTube. So you can subscribe here. You can also look up the audio version. Just type in Sports Detective Podcast wherever you get your podcast. So to get into the kind of meat of the content here in this video. If you've been following the NBA so far this season, one of the more depressing storylines has been the Detroit Pistons, because right now the Detroit Pistons are on the verge of history. Last night they lost to the Atlanta Hawks. And the Hawks are kind of like a team that, like, maybe they aren't reaching their expectations this year, but they're still like a quality, solid team. The Pistons played pretty well. Cade dropped 43, still in a losing effort. And right now, the Detroit Pistons are on a 24 game losing streak, which I'm going to show you this article here from, I believe this is CBSSports.com. And if you look at this article here, basically it kind of lines up. Oops, I'm at the bottom of it. It is comparing this losing streak to previous losing streaks in NBA history. So you look at the top ones here. You have the Sixers up here twice with a 28 game losing streak in 2015. And that was, if you remember that time, that was like the process, the tanking, where they just had. I didn't realize their tanking was really this bad for the process until I actually went and read this article here, because they're also tied for the second longest losing streak in the season prior. And then you have the Cleveland Cavaliers up here, and remember in 2010, 2011, remember that was like post LeBron, and LeBron left them. I don't think they were necessarily trying to tank in those years, because I still think they kind of wanted to shove it to LeBron a little bit, but they did do pretty bad. And another like quick little thing to remember in that time period, the pick that they got Kyrie Irving with, it wasn't actually their own pick. It was actually the Clippers pick. That's a thing that's kind of lost to history. And then you look at the other one here. Honestly, don't know much about the Cavaliers in the early 80s. I think they might have been a relatively new team. Maybe they were a little bit of an expansion team at that time. I don't know. Maybe they were around in the 70s. I could probably go and check. But you have the Pistons here, right here, tied with that Cavaliers team. With right now, they're tied for fourth worst record, losing streak record all time. And then if you look kind of like the teams below them here, Vancouver Grizzlies, that's around when they were kind of like an early young franchise. You have the Denver Nuggets here in the late 90s, who, if you don't know much about the Denver Nuggets, basically your best case too to kind of elevate Carmelo Anthony's legacy with the Nuggets was the Nuggets were basically like a tire fire throughout the entire 90s. And they really just were not a good franchise. They were doing the classic stuff of picking like bad players over and over again. So that team was pretty bad. Charlotte here too. Again, that was a very, very bad Charlotte team. It's either like these teams that were like very kind of like young, new, maybe stars had left at some point. But the kind of difference between that team or these teams here and the Pistons is the Pistons had kind of tanked these last 2 years. They got the first pick in the draft of a Cade Cunningham. They did get a Jaden Ivey really high up. They got a Thompson twin in the top 5 last year. And it's kind of like, okay, you've been tanking these last few years. They made one of the bigger, I don't know if you call like, I guess you could call this one of the bigger, splashier hires or signings in the offseason, which is they signed head coach Monty Williams to be the richest head coach per year in the NBA. And kind of the belief was that was like, if you look at Monty Williams in his tenure at previous jobs, he took over New Orleans kind of in the beginning of the Anthony Davis run. And he really kind of helped them kind of like get into a form where they're kind of a fringe playoff team. He took this Suns team where they had that little bit of that bubble run. They trade for Chris Paul, and then they're off to the NBA Finals. So it was kind of the belief that, like, hey, Monty Williams comes in here. He's an optimist. If you ever hear him speak about a lot of things, he's very optimistic. He's very much a faith-driven person in his life, and I think that reflects a lot in his coaching style. And you kind of thought, oh, maybe he can get the message across to these young kids and kind of teach them more better winning habits? Is he maybe the coach that's going to be there for 15 years? Probably not, but maybe for like a 5-year period here, maybe he can help this team go from one of the worst teams that keeps getting a top 5 lottery pick to maybe this season they could be kind of like a fringe playing team. And that's what's just so amazing here too is like that's what they're trying to be. They're not trying to tank. Those other teams that we saw on there were either trying to tank, were either run so poorly that like they inadvertently tanked. And I don't think that's really the situation with the Pistons here. And again, too, you can go and look at their roster, and they've had like there's been some players have been out, like Bogdanovich for them has been out a lot. But like if you have Cade Cunningham, who was the first pick in the draft, who's averaging like 22 points a game, he's played in every game except for one. I know Jalen Duren's gotten hurt, but Jaden Ivey's been healthy. Um, like this team, I don't know what the heck is going wrong with them. It is honestly very, very astonishing. And most teams at this point would be like, all right, like this losing streak's pathetic. We definitely weren't trying to do this. We're just going to fire our coach, and maybe getting a new assistant coach in to be an interim for the rest of the year will kind of jolt some energy into this team. But they're not going to do that, obviously, because like I just said earlier, they made that big move to sign Monty Williams and make him the highest paid coach in the NBA until Greg Popovich signed an extension, and then Popovich ended up toppling him on that list. But fear not for Pistons fans, because if you do go and you look at, I'm going to share their upcoming schedule here on the screen. If you look at their schedule, this is on NBA.com. Here it is. If you go on NBA.com here, their next game is Thursday at home against the Utah Jazz. An important thing to remember about this game, and an important thing to remember when you're talking about potentially betting on NBA teams, if you're talking about potentially, forecasting games and stuff, and like games where it's like, maybe there's a sneaky upset here. If you are one of those daily bettors, a lot of it comes down to rest, travel, and back-to-backs a lot of times. And they're playing the Utah Jazz at home on Thursday. The Wednesday night before that game, the Utah Jazz are playing in Cleveland. So they have a road back-to-back. So they're in Cleveland Wednesday, and then they have to travel to Detroit the next day. Another important thing here with Utah too, I've been hearing kind of like they're kind of having a little bit of a fire sale with a lot of their players, like for the right price, Lauri Markkanen can get moved. There's guys like Colin Sexton, Jordan Clarkson. Maybe there's a little bit of like a kind of psyche there where maybe some of these guys start to play a little bit more selfish and out of the team kind of like scheme here, trying to maybe up their trade value. So maybe somebody really jumps, in the next few weeks or something and makes a move for one of them. So that's something to monitor there too. Also, the Jazz aren't necessarily like last year. They got off to like a really hot start and kind of faded down the stretch a little bit. They're 10-17 so far this year. They're very much a beatable team if Detroit can like kind of get it together. That's another astonishing thing about the losing streak right now too, is in this current day of basketball, some nights some teams can just get lucky from three and win. And there's other nights some teams can be incredibly unlucky from three and lose. And the fact that like in a 24-game losing streak, again, a Pistons team that's not necessarily trying to lose. This isn't a take for Wembanyama situation. And this is also at the beginning of the season too. If you looked at a lot of those previous losing streaks too, a lot of them really aren't like October 1st to like December something. Because usually, and if they are, it's usually like teams that are trying to tank. And again, this Pistons team isn't necessarily trying to tank. The next game, though, for if for some reason they can't get it and they get to 25, the next game, though, for the Pistons here, Saturday on the road at Brooklyn. Brooklyn, similarly to Utah, plays the night before, so they are going to be catching Brooklyn on the second day of a back-to-back. Brooklyn, another team, too, they're kind of floating around that kind of play-in range in the Eastern Conference standings there. They have a lot of talented players, but not necessarily a team that's like, oh, they should, like Brooklyn's just, oof, Brooklyn's a really tough game coming up. Ugh, don't know about that one. And then they have Brooklyn again Tuesday. And then I believe here, I'll scroll down a little bit on the screen. After that Brooklyn game, then they have the Celtics, and then they have the Raptors. And I believe, so if they lose, so the Celtics game would tie the losing streak. The Raptors game would break the losing streak. as much as we like to see these history things go, and I know the Pistons are very much a laughing stock right now. Like I saw like the uh what is it? The Predator, where it's Carl Weathers and Arnold Schwarzenegger, where their arms are like, they have the muscular like handshake. And it was kind of a funny meme where it was like Carolina Panthers 2 wins, Detroit Pistons 2 wins. They've kind of become the laughing stock of the NBA here. I do, unfortunately, if you are rooting for the history to be broken here, I do think that they're going to get one of these games. I think they are very much being woken up now more than they were. Kate Cunningham, like I said, the last night had 43 against the Hawks. Um, I think they'll end up doing it here, but dang, Detroit, this is a very ugly situation here because I've kind of talked about this the other or last week when we had Jake Madison on. We talked about the Pistons a little bit, and or maybe it was Jake Madison. I can't remember. It was one of the interviews I did last week, and it was kind of like the Warriors are in a situation right now where Draymond might be becoming a little bit more trouble than he's worth. And people have always kind of like theorized, like, hey, Draymond played at Michigan State, has a lot of affection for that area, that part of the country, and grew up as a Pistons fan, I believe. So maybe like it'd be if he was ever to get moved anywhere, or he was gonna get signed somewhere else, it would maybe be Detroit. And you have a situation here where the Pistons are very much in need of like a culture change. Now, maybe they don't want the Draymond Green punting dudes in the balls or like punching dudes in the face kind of culture, but if he can add kind of like a more toughness culture, maybe more of a winning habits culture, maybe that's something where the Pistons kind of say to themselves like, "Hey, maybe we give up two or three things here for a little bit maybe of a long-term loss because maybe you give up on some young pieces that could potentially be something one day. But maybe Draymond Green and kind of the twilight of his career can really kind of help push the Pistons in a more positive direction with guys like Cade Cunningham, maybe a Jaden Ivey still around, um, Jalen Duren, who I kind of like. So there you have it. That's something I've kind of theorized, a little bit of a thought I've had. Leave your thoughts in the comment section if you think that one, are they gonna become the worst losing streak in NBA history, and what are things that the Pistons should just do kind of long term to make sure something as terrible as this doesn't happen again, and maybe they don't lose 70 games this year.